Today I'm going to talk to you about casualties. Now, this is not a specific talk about TC3, which means Tactical Combat Casualty Care Protocols. It's not a specific talk about those tactical TC3 protocols. It's a separate thing. I might talk around that a little bit, but what I want to generally talk about is casualties and how to plan for and implications, and just talk around the topic of it, because it might be something that people haven't really fully considered in a realistic manner. So at class, I have a little saying. One of my little sayings, there's quite a few sayings that we go, we get you at class. But one of them is that the two hardest things you're going to do, the first one is locating the enemy, and the second one is evacuating a casualty under fire. Now, if you think about that for a minute, it's given that the two hardest things that you're going to do in combat are locate the enemy and secondly evacuate a casualty under fire. If you think about it, those two things might be happening at exactly the same time. So that's an extremely stressful and difficult situation. I may as well, by means of an anecdote on this, I got to come out with a war story every now and again. Try not to kind of use those situations which involve people that I know that too much. But for example, in Fallujah in 2006, we were on a mission, and we went to a mission at a compound, and we were in these big armored personnel carriers, actually sort of South African armored personnel carriers, and they only have a door that opens on the back. They've got two turret gunners and a door that opens on the back. And so we completed this, and one thing we learned from this was that one of the vehicles had been parked outside the compound, but it hadn't been turned. So given that you could only get in through the back, and the back was not facing the entrance through the wall to the compound, so this individual on our team, he was a saw gunner, and he was running back to the vehicle, and he took fire. And he actually took fire, and some of the rounds hit the saw that he was carrying, causing him to stumble and drop it. And then he kind of went around the back of this of the armored personnel carrier, and there's like a step up. It's kind of high vehicle, and so he stepped up on the back, bending over. He's wearing body armor, obviously. And he actually took rounds underneath, as he was bent over, took rounds underneath the body armor. And so immediately we've got this crazy situation where those are up in the turrets are attempting to locate, which we did locate, where the fire was coming from sort of a tall building, and dragging him into the back of the vehicle, and then obviously returning fire and moving off as fast as possible. And what was extremely sad about this situation was that he'd actually had his aorta ruptured, and so he was actually dead on arrival back at the cache on Camp Fallujah. So tragic situation, chaos if you think about it. So there's a lot of things going on there, and there is the fact that you need to locate the enemy in order to return fire, at the same time as dealing with a casualty, and at the same time as trying to evacuate the casualty. Obviously, in terms of TC3 protocol, there wasn't really much we could do for him at that time, and there wasn't. But you can imagine if this had not taken place at the back of an armored personnel carrier. If we were dismounted, a similar thing had happened, and we'd had to move him and extract him, which happens frequently. And it also happens in situations where you may be some distance from the vehicles, or you have to bring in a helicopter, etc., and you have to move that casualty. And this causes all sorts of problems. So, trying to portray to you here, using an anecdote, etc., that this is high stress, high difficult situation. It's going to be very physically difficult, and you've got to prepare for it as much as you can. How can you prepare for it? Well, given my audience out here, I'm not exactly sure talking, on YouTube like this, exactly what everybody that I'm talking to here, how exactly you're going to apply that. So, some of you guys are going to be preppers, some of you guys, military, law enforcement, whatever, how exactly you're going to apply this, and what are the circumstances that you're going to apply it in. So, firstly, one of the things you want to do is avoid taking casualties. So a lot of that comes down to mission planning, avoidance, threat mitigation, etc. It also then comes down to your tactical training, your team tactical training, in order to be able to respond to and deal with a threat in an effective manner. That is also tied in extremely closely to physical fitness. If you've got the physical fitness, then you're going to be able to move, get into fire positions, have the ability to return fire, have the ability to, take cover, move position, and conduct small unit tactics effectively. If you don't have the physical fitness, you're not going to be able to do it. The other thing about physical fitness, it's absolutely key, guys. If you're thinking about in any way operating in a tactical kinetic environment, you need to work on the physical fitness. It's just absolutely at the root of it. Why do you think in the military we have all these selection tests, do all this PT, have standards? You're kidding yourself otherwise. The other thing about PT is two things. There's two factors to PT. Firstly, if you do have a casualty, then if you don't actually have the physical fitness yourself, you're not going to be able to move or drag or whatever, litter carry that casualty. The other thing is if you've got guys that are huge and they become a casualty, that is a massive burden on the rest of the team who have to actually move that casualty. And that's sort of a general thing nowadays, particularly with the weight of equipment and just guys getting bigger and larger and all that kind of thing. It just is hard. It's really hard to move people. The other thing is, if you're going to operate, some of you won't like this, in a tactical environment, carrying small arms, etc., wear ballistic plates. Wear a plate carrier. It's going to significantly reduce the threat of penetrating trauma to the torso, okay, thoracic region, etc. It's not going to stop all of those things, but it's going to significantly reduce the chances of death. Because if you can, if wounds are more to the extremities, then you're more into the zone of the three main preventable causes of death. Treating the three main preventable causes of death, which is what we deal with TC3, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. So obviously I just slipped into that unwittingly, but clearly what those TC3 protocols are having you do is deal as best as you can with massive hemorrhage as an extremity bleeding, airway obstruction, and tension pneumothorax, sucking chest wound. Okay, and if you're wearing ballistic plates, you're going to reduce the injuries that you might sustain. So all these things are key, and it's very important to be real about this, to be reality, and not living in some kind of fantasy about this. One of the issues I see is that there are some basic principles, military tactical principles, that are applicable in whatever unconventional environment you think that you may be operating in. But there are certain inescapable sort of tactical realities which I want to talk about now. So, given that it's extremely hard to evacuate a casualty, particularly under fire, even if you get the casualty away from the contact point and you're trying to evacuate the casualty, then dismounted on foot, it's going to be practically extremely hard. So there are a number of protocol in TC3, and one of them is that the only intervention allowed in the care under fire phase, which is actually while the firefight is going on and you're still in contact with the enemy, the only permissible intervention is a tourniquet high and tight on a limb to prevent death from massive hemorrhage. Preferably, that is self-aid by the casualty. But given that depending on the nature of the wound, they may have 30 seconds from that gunshot wound before they bleed out, for example, from a femoral. I mean, it could be 30 seconds, it could be 3 minutes. So clearly, you want to be getting a tourniquet on, but also you've got to return fire. Otherwise, more people are going to die. So it's a complicated situation that you have to train for. And during that period, you can't be doing any sort of complex medical intervention. So it's basically tourniquet or nothing. And then you've also got to think about how you're going to move that casualty. So in that initial firefight phase, if you're going forwards, then the casualty has to stay where the casualty is whilst the firefight is dealt with. If you're trying to break contact away from the enemy, then you have to drag the casualty back on bounds until you can get to a sufficient point where you're away from the enemy, you've broken contact, and then you can think of another casualty evacuation plan. Bring people in, etc. Maybe actually at that point pick the casualty up, use whatever litter you're going to have, etc. Litters is a big problem. So depending on what you've got with you, if you've got a pole litter, a rigid litter, then that's a lot easier to carry, and you can do that. Well, at a pinch, you can do it with 2 people, but really 4 people. If you're on some kind of dismounted patrol and you're carrying a poleless litter, one of those fold-up sort of fabric litters, then they really, to be effective, they take 6 people to carry. Otherwise, it sags right down in the middle. You need 6 people on it. So if you think about that, if you start to think about that, depending on the size of this patrol, maybe it's a small reconnaissance patrol at 4. You take 1 casualty. You've got to think about security as you move. And you've got to think about carrying the casualty if the casualty is not ambulatory. Okay? So you've immediately got a big issue. What that's going to do, even at a squad level, if it's going to take 6 people to carry the poleless litter, and then you've got to think about security. One of them's a casualty, one of them's the leader, maybe one's the medic. You don't have any extra people. And it becomes extremely physically hard, even if you take away the fact of the actual enemy contact. Let's just say that that's gone away at this point, and now you're just moving to evacuate the casualty. So it becomes an issue. So at some point, you may become physically exhausted or physically incapable of moving the casualty any further. So let's just take a step back for a minute. What was your plan in the first place? Did you have a mission brief before you went out? Obviously, you tried to mitigate the threat. You tried to route selection, whatever you were doing, the reconnaissance patrol, etc. But now something's happened. You've taken a casualty and you've managed to break contact, but it's going to be physically exhausting to move the casualty out of there. What's your plan? Well, in general, if you're going to run an operation, this should not be done in a vacuum. So what there should be is there should be reliable communications back to an operations center. Even if that's manned by just 1 guy. There should be a patrol plan. You should be able to call back. And what you really need to have, and this is where I'm talking about the tactical realities here, is you need to have a quick reaction force, vehicle-mounted quick reaction force. So on this patrol, you're either moving back to some vehicles that you used, or you should be calling the quick reaction force, and the quick reaction force should be moving to you. And so in general, you need to think about sensible, practical use of vehicles as part of your patrolling, whether that be, combination foot mobile, whatever it is, so you're not just completely dismounted. And so what you should generally think about vehicles, and that might be trucks, side-by-sides, 4-wheelers, whatever you're going to use, if you think about that as ammunition forward, casualties to the rear, then you're on the right track. So hopefully what will happen is you may be exhausted moving this casualty. If you can't move the casualty any further, then you might have to consider what we would call strong pointing. And strong pointing means that you will find some kind of defensible position. Classically, that would be a compound, or it could just be a small hill, with some rocks, something that you can get in amongst, and you would strong point there. And how serious that situation is depends on the enemy threat, what the numbers are, whether they're following you up, exactly what situation is. And you would strong point there because you're unable to physically move the casualty anymore, and the QRF, quick reaction force, should deploy to you, thus bringing additional numbers to help, and also bringing vehicles in order to help to evacuate the casualty. So you've got to consider these things. Your operations do need a certain number of people to make them tactically feasible. There needs to be things like communications, quick reaction forces, etc. Depending on the sort of the unconventional nature of the situation that you're involved in, you also have to consider the realities of who may be making up these tactical teams. And if you're not in the military, obviously in the military, it's a close-knit situation. But if in an unconventional situation, it may be even more close-knit because you might be talking close family members here. And you've got to be exactly realistic when you plan these things and when you discuss your actions on, actions on this and actions on that, which are part of your patrol rehearsals and briefing. You need to be realistic about what you're talking about. So let me give an example of that. You don't want to be sort of unrealistic, sort of fantasy land, all hoo-ah about it and say, yeah, if you're a casualty, we'll leave you with like a 9mm and a hand grenade. If you're not actually going to do that, then don't even talk about it. One of the things you've got to consider as well is, and when we teach you tactics at Max Velocity Tactical, we're teaching you the whole gamut of small unit tactics. So we're teaching you how to assault forwards, break contact to the rear, to the flanks, all these kind of things. And you need to know how to conduct these maneuvers on the battlefield. So be realistic when you talk about casualties, because it's all very well to talk about a break contact drill, and we'll train that break contact drill, and as long as we have no casualties, that's fine. But what if you do take a casualty during a break contact drill, and during what part of the break contact drill? What if it's actually a loved one? You've got to talk about maybe some hard decisions. Is someone obviously dead, grey matter shot to the head? And is that going to endanger the rest of the team? One of the things we've got going on in the US military is, as things evolved over time, US military's got a lot of assets, and the whole idea of never leaving anybody behind, including a dead body. And so much so that more risk and more casualties will be taken to extract a dead body from a situation. If you're conducting some kind of unconventional warfare, you may just literally may not have the ability to even think like that. The other side of it is, if you've got someone wounded, team member, loved one, etc., laying there screaming, well, your break contact drill kind of took a left turn at that point. So are you going to continue to try and conduct the break contact drill whilst trying to drag them out? Or if you can't move them for whatever reason, or suddenly you take another casualty, and depending on your numbers, I would suggest that if that is a loved one, you're probably not going to leave them there. Or you should talk about this. So you may have to shift that break contact into an assault, or maybe perhaps some kind of strong point in place. So you need to talk about and figure out exactly what you really are going to do. You can see that this talk is, it's a lot beyond a sort of, just a brief, we're not just covering drills here. We're trying to cover some realities of what you actually might do in these situations. One of the big issues is, if we're talking TC3, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, then what you're really trying to do is you're trying to keep the casualty alive from the point of wounding through evacuation until they can reach definitive care. So definitive care is some kind of medical facility. Like the example I used in the anecdote at the beginning, definitive care was the cache on Camp Fallujah. Now, depending on your unconventional warfare situation or your time to definitive care, then that's where these protocols become an issue, because you can, for example, tourniquet high and tight, stop the massive hemorrhage, you can extract the casualty, but where are you going to extract them to, and what level of care are they going to have? And that's something that you need to consider and plan for in terms of, what are we talking about here? Some people want to talk about a complete collapse situation. There's people talking about like civil war, this kind of situation. Well, who's to say that we don't still have doctors and things in civil war, but at the same time, what's the level of medical facility and even more so than that, what's the level? It's not so much whether you have a doctor or not, but it's more about what exactly, this is not current times where there's a full surgical team with all the various assets in the hospital that are tied to that, and the labs and all the machines and all this kind of stuff. So you could end up somewhere between sort of 1860 level care and some kind of situation between that and what we currently have in current times in a modern hospital. So these are all things that need to be considered. One of the things that's interesting is that certainly in my experience and what and also through observation, that what tends to happen in combat situations is that you tend to get away with a lot, and there's a lot of sort of close calls. It's sort of it's a fascinating subject in terms of close calls. A friend of mine recently had his ear shot off. Can you think about sort of hanging, had it sewn back on? Can you imagine what closer call that is? And if you start to think about that, drive you insane. Like if the guy had aimed just a little bit, that kind of thing, drive you insane thinking about that. So it's one of those things where you tend to get away with a lot and things happen and you don't take casualties, but then suddenly what happens is it takes a left turn, boom, and then you've got that casualty. And that's either a wounded, someone's going to survive, or and that can be absolutely horrific, or it could be someone like my anecdote where you actually lose someone. And so therefore at that point it takes a left turn, and that's an extremely stressful situation that you have to deal with and operate in. And hence is why I'm going to tell you the hardest things you're going to do is locate the enemy and evacuate a casualty under fire. Both of those things are probably going to be happening at the same time. So I think in summary, there's a few things you need to consider about the idea of casualties, how you may actually react should things take a left turn and you actually take casualties. I've talked before, and there's probably a subject for another Max talk here, but I've talked about the various freezes. I talked about training and the RTR drill, etc., and the various freezes that you get. And also I probably need to do a sort of a talk on fear and sort of fear in a combat situation. I think that your best defense here is, in order to try and avoid taking casualties. I mean, like I said, casualties just sometimes they just happen, and then you've got to deal with it. But if you consider it that if you are trained proper small unit tactics, which is going to give you the drills, it's going to give the reactions, it's going to give you the ability to break the freezes so that you're not just sort of hanging out there as a target. That first freeze when the contact happens, the second freeze when you get into cover. And so you can, the whole idea of these drills is to blow through the freezes. If you've got the physical fitness so that you're not exhausted while moving before the contact, and therefore you've got the physical fitness also to move once the contact starts, take proper positions to cover, move fast, keep low, etc. Proper tactical training, good physical fitness. Also wear ballistic plates if you're in that kind of kinetic combat situation. If you're carrying a rifle, a battle rifle for some kind of combat situation, wear plates. Simple. You can do these things to mitigate casualties. You also need to think about, if you're building an unconventional team to deal with, you're building the full warrior mindset, the whole warrior. If you're building that and you've got a team and you're working together, you need to think about the true sort of tactical context of it and how you're actually going to plan operations. That's why we're talking chess, not checkers here at Max Velocity Tactical. It's not about shooting steel pew pew on flat range all the time, because you've got to think about how you're going to apply that in a real life situation. Are you going to have patrols going out? Why? What are you going to be doing? What's the threat going to be? If we've got some kind of situation, do we have an operations room? Do we have communications? Do we have a quick reaction force so that we can get ammunition forward and casualties to the rear, etc.? All these things need to be considered. You need to think about, if you're going to go out there in a position where you may take casualties, then you need to think about what you're going to do once those casualties are taken. Hardest thing you're going to do, locate the enemy, evacuate a casualty under fire. I hope that was not too rambling. A lot of thoughts going down in there. It's probably going to generate another talk because there's a big subject. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Get the word out. Like it. Share it. We're talking real stuff here on these Max Talks. This isn't the normal YouTube fluff. Okay, this is Max Talks are real tactics, the reality of tactics, the reality of combat. Thanks very much.